1,967. The skies over North Vietnam shimmered with heat and tension. At 20,000 feet, a Soviet-trained MiG-21 pilot scanned the horizon. His instruments lit up with a radar warning, but there was nothing ahead. No contrails, no silhouettes, no dogfight, just silence. Then his wingman vanished in a burst of light. No engine noise, no maneuver, just gone. For a few seconds, the radio stayed quiet. Then panic filled the channel. Soviet advisors listening in Hanoi froze as one phrase repeated from the pilot still airborne. "I didn't see anything. He just exploded." That was the moment it began. The moment Soviet doctrine built on generations of visual combat, heroic dogfights, and turn-radius supremacy collapsed into uncertainty. The Americans had introduced something the Soviets hadn't prepared for, something that didn't make sense to their tactical logic. A missile fired from beyond the horizon, a weapon that didn't require sight, a kill made by radar, not reflexes, and the Phantom jet was its harbinger. Outfitted with radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles and powerful onboard tracking systems, the USF-4 Phantom changed the equation. It didn't need to see its target. It didn't need to maneuver behind it. It only needed a lock. And that meant the Soviets weren't just losing jets. They were losing time. Every second spent closing in for a dogfight was now a second closer to death. Phantom crews could fire from 20, 30, even 40 kilometers out long before the MiG pilot even knew a threat existed. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't a fight at all. It was execution at distance. In briefing rooms across the Soviet sphere, commanders stared at mission reports with disbelief. How could an American pilot, firing from so far away, strike with such lethal precision? They blamed errors. They blamed luck. But deep down, they feared something worse. That their entire understanding of aerial combat was outdated. That America had leapt ahead not with faster planes, but with invisible reach. And so began a quiet panic inside Soviet Air Command. Because the Phantom was no longer a blip on radar. It was a ghost, a killer that didn't wait to be seen. For over a decade, Soviet air combat doctrine had been built around one assumption. The dogfight was king. Every pilot was trained to close the distance, get behind the enemy, and unleash cannons or heat-seeking missiles within visual range. Victory was determined by reflexes, G-tolerance, and split-second maneuvers. It was a legacy inherited from World War II and reinforced through hundreds of training sorties across the USSR's vast military districts. The MiG-15 had ruled the Korean War skies through agility. The MiG-17 was designed to outturn Western jets. The MiG-21, small and razor-fast, was built to streak into visual range, unleash its guns or short-range missiles, and escape. Soviet engineers and pilots alike believed that speed and close-in agility would always determine the winner. But they had a problem. They assumed their enemies fought by the same rules. In classrooms across Soviet Air Force academies, missile warfare was treated as a theoretical possibility, not a central tactic. AIM-7 Sparrows were known to Soviet analysts on paper, but American missile reliability was considered low. Environmental factors, cloud cover, clutter, ECM were expected to render them unreliable in combat. Soviet doctrine emphasized evasion, not preemption. And so, when U.S. Navy and Air Force Phantoms began racking up kills at distances the MiGs couldn't even measure, the Soviet command structure reeled. They assumed the kills were flukes, that pilots had gotten lucky. That radar lock wasn't strong enough to sustain missile guidance across long distances. They underestimated the integration between the F-4's AWG-10 radar and the AIM-7's semi-active homing head. Most importantly, they made a fatal assumption about time. They believed their pilots would always have it. Time to react. Time to spot the enemy. Time to maneuver. But the Phantoms had already eliminated that. They were killing MiGs before a single Soviet-trained pilot could turn their head. Worse still, the Soviet system relied on ground control intercept. Pilots were rarely given autonomy to engage at will. Instead, they were guided into position by radar controllers on the ground, a method that worked in theory but failed catastrophically when the Americans struck outside visual range and outside GCI detection arcs. This miscalculation wasn't just tactical, it was ideological. The USSR believed in control from the ground up. Its pilots were expected to follow procedures, not improvise. But Phantom crews had trained to kill in chaos, under minimal guidance, with split-second decisions. They weren't just flying different aircraft. They were fighting a different war. In the vaults of Soviet air doctrine, air combat was a symmetrical contest. Both sides entered visual range, both maneuvered, and the better pilot, or the better aircraft, won. This vision had worked for decades. From the Battle of Britain to the skies over Korea, it was a formula that rewarded aggression, training, and numbers. It had produced heroes, legends, and victories. But by the mid-1960s, that doctrine was quietly falling apart, and the Americans knew it before the Soviets did. The foundational concept of Soviet aerial defense was the PVO Strany, the country's vast air defense network. It depended on high-speed interceptors, rapid ground control, and point defense missile systems. In theory, any incursion could be tracked and neutralized with lethal efficiency. Fighters like the MiG-21 were deployed as fast reaction units, directed by radar operators on the ground toward visual engagement zones. But there was a catch. All of it assumed one thing: that the enemy had to come close. When the U.S. introduced the AIM-7 Sparrow alongside the Phantom II, that assumption exploded. Now, American fighters didn't need to come close. They could detect, lock, and kill from miles away beyond the edge of Soviet radar visibility, and far outside the MiG's engagement envelope. Soviet pilots were caught in a doctrine that no longer applied. Their training emphasized merge range, the moment where the two aircraft entered visual contact and combat began. Their tactics were built around heat-seeking missiles and cannon runs. They drilled endlessly in simulated turning duels, practiced radar avoidance maneuvers, and relied heavily on ground command to steer them into firing position. The Phantom broke that model. It didn't merge. It hunted from distance. The problem was institutional. Soviet air combat philosophy hadn't evolved past the belief that technological parity was unnecessary. They didn't need long-range sensors because they didn't believe the Americans had reliable long-range weapons. That illusion shattered in 1967 when kill after kill occurred without warning, without visual contact, and without the chance to fight back. Inside Soviet command rooms, generals were forced to confront the reality that their fighters were no longer interceptors, they were targets. And while new interceptors like the MiG-23 were being developed with radar-guided missiles of their own, the philosophical pivot had not yet arrived. Officers debated the morality and validity of unseen warfare. Some dismissed it as cowardice. Others quietly admitted it was future doctrine. In truth, it was already past doctrine. The Americans were not waiting for the future. They were already killing from it. The turning point came on the 17th of June, 1967, over the dense canopy of North Vietnam. A four-ship formation of MiG 21 seconds scrambled to intercept what appeared to be a routine U.S. bombing run. Ground controllers vectored them in, expecting another textbook intercept. The MiG pilots climbed aggressively, radar screens crackling with updates from below. But then, in the space of 30 seconds, everything unraveled. Before a single MiG had visual contact, the lead aircraft disintegrated mid-air. No warning. No visible enemy, just a sudden, fiery detonation. The pilot's wingman veered off instinctively, only to be hit moments later. Another kill. No visual contact, no dogfight. Only after the third aircraft was struck did one of the remaining pilots catch a glimpse of something. Two contrails arcing high above, barely visible in the sky. The Americans hadn't come in low. They hadn't come in slow. They were Phantom IIs operating well above 25,000 feet, flying fast. and firing AIM-7 Sparrows from distances that Soviet doctrine had declared ineffective. For the surviving pilot, the confusion was total. In his debrief, he insisted there had been no contact, no chance to evade, and no radar lock that he could detect. He called the encounter a ghost attack. But it wasn't a ghost. It was the first fully executed beyond visual range engagement, using coordinated radar tracking and live missile telemetry. The Phantoms had used AWACS support and their own powerful AWG-10 radars to establish long-range tracking. Their AIM 7 seconds didn't require heat signatures or visual confirmation. They just needed a solid radar lock, and once they had it, the missiles took care of the rest. The Soviets were stunned. They had seen Sparrow statistics on paper range estimates, guidance specs, but dismissed most of it as inflated propaganda. The missile had a reputation for unreliability, especially in earlier versions. What they hadn't realized was that American air crews had adapted. They trained to fire in coordinated salvos. They fired under specific parameters, angles, altitudes, speeds that maximized the missile's kill probability. They weren't guessing anymore. They were executing. From this moment forward, Soviet pilots began entering combat zones with a new kind of anxiety. The rules had changed. Visibility no longer guaranteed survival. Sometimes, it guaranteed nothing at all. The first impossible event was no longer a fluke. It was a warning. A signal that the air war had entered a new phase one where missiles replaced maneuver, and death came from beyond the horizon. The initial reports coming out of Vietnam were not just troubling, they were dismissed outright. Soviet military attachés stationed in Hanoi forwarded transcripts of MiG pilot debriefings to Moscow. The tone was consistent. No visual contact, no warning, sudden explosions. One pilot even claimed he was fired upon by a ghost. At first, the Soviet General Staff refused to accept the implications. Senior commanders argued that American missile technology had too many failure points. They cited Sparrow's known reliability issues, guidance interruptions, failure to detonate, or poor performance in poor weather. In closed-door sessions, Soviet aerospace engineers confidently presented graphs and equations. They insisted, a radar-guided missile cannot maintain a lock through Vietnam's dense jungle clutter and weather interference. It was, they said, physically impossible. Worse, they were not just denying enemy capabilities, they were defending their own pride. For Soviet planners, air combat was a domain they believed they had mastered. Their MiGs had tangled with sabers in Korea and come away respected. Their missile systems were exported worldwide and had shot down American aircraft before. The idea that the U had quietly leapt ahead with a functional beyond visual range kill system was not just strategically threatening, it was ideologically intolerable. So the reports were filtered. The language was softened. Engagements labeled as ambiguous. Some incidents were written off as pilot error. Others were blamed on accidents. The phrase, unknown ordnance, began appearing in the margins of kill reports. And behind every denial was fear. Because the logic was damning. If the U.S. could strike at range, and the Soviets could not, then every MiG launched in a conflict zone was flying into a trap. The entire Soviet air doctrine built around short-range interception, visual combat, and GCI coordination was suddenly brittle. Still, the Politburo demanded more proof. They sent electronic warfare teams to Vietnam. New countermeasure protocols were issued. Training was revised to emphasize radar evasion, tighter formations, and increased jamming. But none of it addressed the core issue. The enemy could shoot before being seen, and no amount of theory, protest, or political denial could change the kill logs stacking up over Southeast Asia. Soviet advisors in Vietnam sent one final desperate communique to their superiors. These are not isolated incidents. The Americans have changed the nature of aerial engagement. Moscow didn't want to believe it, but the sky already had. With the kill reports mounting and the silence of Soviet pilots becoming deafening, the leadership in Moscow found itself under increasing pressure to explain the inexplicable. But instead of acknowledging the full reality of what had happened over Vietnam, Soviet analysts proposed a new, deeply flawed theory. They claimed the Americans weren't actually firing from range at all. Instead, the kills were being made by decoy tactics, phantom signals generated by airborne jammers, or ground-based electronic warfare units. The missiles, according to this theory, were being launched under false radar conditions that tricked Soviet and North Vietnamese pilots into believing they were being killed from beyond visual range. The Phantom's long-range radar system, supposedly overrated. The Sparrow missile, still considered too unreliable to consistently hit fast-moving MiGs beyond 5 kilometers. To the upper ranks of the Soviet air defense forces, this explanation was not only comforting, it was politically useful. It preserved the idea that Soviet pilots were still the equals, if not the superiors, of their Western counterparts. It also kept faith in their air defense philosophy alive. Close-range maneuver warfare, command-directed interceptions, and reliance on numerical superiority. But the theory was disastrously wrong. What they were calling decoys were real radar locks. What they claimed were EW distortions were coordinated engagements between Phantom pilots and AWACS controllers. What they dismissed as propaganda were radar-guided missile kills confirmed by wreckage, pilot survivors, and even captured MiG black boxes. Yet the theory persisted. Soviet aviation journals circulated dense technical rebuttals of American performance claims. One article argued that Sparrow missiles couldn't function properly in tropical humidity despite direct evidence of high-altitude kills. Another insisted that the Phantom's AWG-10 radar lacked the fidelity to track MiGs during evasive maneuvers, despite logs showing radar locks were maintained for full missile guidance cycles. By clinging to this theory, the Soviet command allowed its fighter squadrons to keep flying the same way straight into invisible kill zones. Dozens more MiG pilots died, never having seen what killed them. The refusal to accept that America had cracked the code of long-range air dominance cost more than aircraft. It delayed innovation. It suppressed urgent reforms in Soviet radar design and pilot training. It turned a doctrine based on discipline into one built on denial. For years afterward, internal memos from Soviet aerospace institutes showed the same echo chamber of flawed assumptions, an empire clinging to a theory while its pilots disappeared into the sky. As combat losses continued and Soviet-trained MiG units struggled to adapt, a second theory emerged, this one even more desperate than the last. If the Americans weren't using radar decoys, then perhaps the kills themselves were fabricated. According to this new internal line of reasoning, U.S. combat reports were being manipulated for propaganda purposes. The theory held that American pilots weren't actually achieving long-range kills, but rather falsifying data triggering missile launches in non-combat zones, then claiming kills on aircraft that were lost due to unrelated failures. Soviet intelligence reports began referring to statistical inflation and strategic bluffing. One classified assessment even suggested that the Americans had deployed a kill-by-press release strategy, making exaggerated claims to demoralize Soviet allies, justify new weapons programs, and intimidate other nations observing the war. There was only one problem: the wreckage didn't lie. North Vietnamese recovery teams routinely found MiG debris fields consistent with high-altitude intercepts. U.S. combat footage confirmed missile launches at standoff distances, and in several cases, Soviet advisors had to witness the aftermath with their own eyes. Twisted fuselages, cockpit sections torn open, engines shattered not by mechanical failure, but by high-velocity fragmentation warheads designed for the AIM-7 Sparrow. Still, the second wrong theory persisted. It was politically safer to accuse the U.S. of lying than to admit the truth that the Phantom II, backed by sophisticated fire control radar and a new doctrine of missile warfare, had made traditional intercept tactics obsolete. Inside Soviet air defense headquarters, the implications were too severe to process quickly. Accepting that long-range engagements were real would mean admitting that every pilot being trained at Lipetsk, every MiG-21 rolling off assembly lines, and every intercept protocol in the Warsaw Pact playbook was dangerously behind the curve. To avoid that truth, generals clung to the narrative of inflated kill logs. They poured resources into counter-information campaigns, trying to debunk American claims with doctored graphs, false timelines, and reports that blamed MiG losses on pilot inexperience, faulty avionics, or sabotage. But inside the Soviet military aviation community, a quiet dissent began to grow. Younger engineers, field commanders, and intelligence officers, those closest to the front lines, started asking dangerous questions. They had seen too many MiGs go down without a fight. They had spoken to too many shaken pilots who described being struck from nowhere. One officer, in a memo that was quickly buried, wrote, "If we are right, why are we dying?" That question would linger, unspoken, through the rest of the war. Because beneath the layers of propaganda and misdirection, a truth had already taken hold. The Americans weren't making it up. They were making history. The Soviet Union had no shortage of analysts, no lack of intercept data, and no blind eye when it came to American military development. Their surveillance networks were vast. Technical dossiers on U.S. aircraft were meticulously compiled. Radar signatures, missile schematics, pilot tactics, Soviet intelligence services had it all. And yet, when the F-4 Phantom II began scoring kills from beyond visual range with lethal precision, the Soviet system failed to predict, identify, or even believe what was happening. This was not a failure of information. It was a failure of interpretation. For years, American engineers had been improving the AIM-7 Sparrow's guidance systems, reducing failure rates, and refining radar lock integration. Test results from U.S. ranges showed a steady increase in missile reliability. Combat simulation programs revealed that radar-guided weapons, when used in coordinated formations, could achieve devastating effects against less electronically equipped opponents. But inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus, these findings were routinely dismissed as inflated projections. Why? Because the Soviet model of analysis was rooted in skepticism of Western claims and overconfidence in their own theory of symmetrical warfare. Intelligence reports that hinted at a paradigm shift were downplayed in favor of assessments that reinforced the status quo. American pilot debriefs were collected and translated, but instead of focusing on their new engagement ranges or radar lock strategies, analysts combed the texts for contradictions to discredit them. The AIM-7's early failures in the 1,960 seconds became the anchor of Soviet certainty. They believed missile technology simply hadn't evolved enough. That belief became dogma. So when combat footage began to emerge, showing Sparrows hitting fast-moving MiGs in full afterburner from 30 kilometers out, Soviet analysts didn't raise red flags. They wrote counter-narratives. One high-level intelligence brief concluded, "American missile improvements are overstated for the benefit of defense contractors." That briefing would not age well. What the Soviets failed to grasp was that the U.S. didn't just improve hardware. They rewrote the software of air combat itself. Phantom crews trained not to chase dogfights, but to create radar space using vector angles, altitudes, and coordinated AWACS tracking to optimize lock time. The F-4 didn't need to see its target. It only needed a signal. Meanwhile, Soviet pilots flew as if the old world still existed. They counted on visibility, on time, on symmetrical engagement. Intelligence failed to warn them that those rules were gone. One North Vietnamese squadron leader, trained under Soviet advisors, described the feeling of facing Phantom-equipped squadrons like this. It was as if the air itself turned against us. We died before the fight began. And still, no systemic change came from Moscow. By the time adjustments were made, upgrades to MiG radars, the introduction of R-23 missiles, new training protocols, the damage had been done. The Soviet Union had watched the revolution unfold from their own radar screens and failed to understand what they were seeing. The Soviet Union had long feared American technology, but it was the American system they never truly understood. It wasn't just a matter of better jets or more advanced missiles. It was how those tools were used, by whom, and under what doctrine. When the U.S. began deploying the F-4 Phantom II with AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, they weren't merely upgrading equipment. They were rewriting air warfare. At the core of the American system was autonomy at the edge. Unlike Soviet pilots, who were trained to follow strict command structures and rely on ground control intercept for vectoring, U.S. pilots were taught to think, decide, and kill independently. The result was a culture of tactical initiative, one where every Phantom crew became a sensor-shooter pair with the power to engage without waiting for orders. Phantom units trained in aggressive BVR, beyond visual range, tactics, using simulated intercepts, and real-time radar lock drills under the supervision of Top Gun and Red Flag programs. These exercises forged an elite cadre of pilots who didn't just understand their systems, they mastered them. Each F-4 Phantom carried the AWG-10 radar, capable of locking targets at 40-plus kilometers, paired with AIM-7 Sparrow missiles that improved dramatically throughout the Vietnam War. While the early models had reliability issues, later variants, particularly the E and M versions, featured enhanced guidance logic, better warheads, and stronger mid-course correction capabilities. But hardware alone didn't win the war. The Americans integrated airborne early warning with their strike packages. E-2 Hawkeyes and EC-121 seconds loitered high above combat zones, feeding real-time target data to fighters far beyond enemy radar coverage. When Soviet-trained MiGs scrambled to intercept, Phantom crews already had their vectors, velocities, and altitudes. They were ready, and they fired first. Even more devastating was the pairing of doctrine and geometry. American air combat strategy emphasized kill chains, where radar, lock-on, missile launch, and post-shot maneuver were practiced to split-second precision. Pilots flew in two-ship elements, with one aircraft designating the target while the other provided cover or executed a simultaneous shot. This system allowed overlapping fields of fire and created engagement envelopes the Soviets had never trained to counter. Soviet radar, by contrast, was limited. GCI command relied on ground-based stations with narrow scopes and slow data feeds. Their pilots flew into unknowns, dependent on brief radio bursts for intercept headings. They didn't hunt. They reacted. And by the time they reacted, the Phantom was gone, or worse, had already fired. Phantom crews didn't just kill MiGs. They manipulated space and time. They shaped engagements using radar, not eyesight. They denied the Soviets what they valued most: control over the air. That's why the MiG pilots died confused. That's why the radar controllers saw blips vanish mid-course. And that's why, even after thousands of pages of Soviet analysis, the answer remained elusive. The Americans weren't just flying jets. They were executing a doctrine built around initiative, shaped by training, and proven by results. It wasn't a better machine. It was a smarter war. It began as a routine combat air patrol near Hanoi. 4 MiG, 21 seconds, freshly fueled and armed, scrambled in a staggered formation. The sky was clear, the radio chatter calm, and the intercept orders straightforward. Investigate unidentified radar returns moving toward Haiphong from the southeast. The pilots expected to see slow bombers or perhaps an F-105 strike package. What they encountered was a silent ambush, an aerial trap laid by Phantom crews who already had every angle covered. As the MiGs accelerated to intercept, their radar scopes showed nothing. No returns, no clear threat. But suddenly, one of the MiGs exploded mid-air, no warning, no missile trail, just obliteration. Seconds later, a second aircraft disintegrated. The last two pilots broke formation in panic, diving and weaving, desperately searching the skies. By then, it was too late. The F-4 Phantoms had already fired and were turning away at supersonic speed. They never entered visual range. They never revealed themselves. 4 MiGs launched. 2 returned. and neither had fired a single shot. That engagement, recorded, analyzed, and dissected by both sides, became known within North Vietnamese squadrons as the Day of Empty Sky. But to Soviet advisors watching from the ground, it was something far worse, a humiliation. The Soviet-trained pilots had followed their protocols. They had flown by the book, but the book had been rewritten without their knowledge. The F-4's radar-guided kill from beyond the horizon shattered not just their formation but their confidence. Soon after, American air crews began exploiting this fear deliberately. False radar pings were transmitted to draw MiGs into traps. Decoy flights lured interceptors into pre-targeted kill zones. And worst of all, SAM radar operators, many of them Soviet-trained, began reporting missile hits that had no missile visible. The result? Total psychological collapse. MiG pilots began ignoring radar cues. GCI controllers faced silent mutinies mid-battle. On at least 2 occasions, North Vietnamese squadrons returned to base without engaging, refusing to climb to altitude when they sensed an invisible threat nearby. One Soviet colonel in a classified internal memo wrote, "Our pilots no longer seek the enemy. They flee shadows. We have trained them to fight ghosts." The Americans knew it too. Phantom crews took advantage of every hesitation. They would climb into the edges of radar detection, emit a brief radar ping, then vanish behind the clouds, forcing a full scramble without ever intending to engage. It was warfare not just of missiles, but of mind games. For the Soviets, the most humiliating part wasn't the kill count. It was the realization that they didn't understand the battlefield anymore. Their rules didn't apply. Their training didn't translate. Their technology wasn't just outmatched, it was irrelevant. The Phantom had done something far more devastating than destroy MiGs. It had destroyed the belief that Soviet air power was supreme. That, in the end, was the most painful kill of all. By the early 1972s, the air war over Vietnam had exposed more than just the limitations of Soviet aircraft. It had detonated the very foundation of Soviet air doctrine. What had once been considered gospel in Moscow, mass deployment, centralized control, and visual range superiority, was now visibly failing in the skies above Southeast Asia, and the results could no longer be hidden. Soviet military advisors returned from Hanoi with troubling reports. Not only were MiGs being shot down before visual contact, but pilots were also increasingly hesitant to engage. Some actively avoided the fight, disobeying GCI instructions and breaking formation. The training pipeline, grounded in dogfight maneuvering and missile avoidance drills, had no answers for long-range standoff attacks launched from invisible enemies. The strategic collapse began at the top. In multiple closed-door sessions, the General Staff received briefings from their intelligence arms that challenged every assumption. The F-4 Phantom II wasn't just outperforming the MiG-21, it was executing an entirely different model of war. The Americans weren't just outgunning Soviet pilots. They were out-thinking them, out-communicating them, and operating in a kill environment that the Soviets couldn't even see. Soviet air doctrine had long relied on numerical advantage, tactical rigidity, and centralized vectoring from the ground. But against American air crews, empowered by airborne early warning systems, superior radar, and pilot-level decision-making, these advantages became liabilities. It wasn't just a tactical failure. It was an ideological one. Communist military theory held that cohesion, discipline, and centralized command would always outperform the chaos of capitalist improvisation. But over Vietnam, it was that very flexibility, the freedom of American pilots to act on information in real time, that led to victory after victory. To accept this was to admit that the entire Soviet model of command, control, and execution was vulnerable. Worse still, the Soviet aerospace industry had to face the fact that its prized designs, the MiG, 21 seconds, the radar networks, the early warning infrastructure were built around assumptions that no longer held. By the time the U.S. began deploying the next wave of platforms, F-15 seconds, F-16 seconds, and AWACS integration, the Soviets were already in strategic retreat. Not on the battlefield, But in doctrine, behind closed doors, furious debates broke out among Soviet air theorists. A new faction emerged, demanding decentralization of air combat control, better radar integration, and pilot-level autonomy. But they were outnumbered by traditionalists clinging to a failed vision, one that had already cost them the skies over Hanoi. The Soviet Union did not just lose a series of air battles, it lost the future of warfare. Years later, as the Cold War wound down and archives slowly opened, former Soviet Air Force officers reviewed the files with quiet disbelief. The memos, once guarded by steel doors and armed sentries, now lay bare. Radar logs showing lock-ons never achieved, intercepted radio calls filled with panic, and analysis after analysis that had missed the most important shift in aerial warfare since the jet age began. It wasn't just the aircraft. It was the doctrine. It was the mind behind the machine. The F-4 Phantom and its beyond visual range tactics had marked a revolution, one the Soviet Union never truly recovered from. Even as newer fighters like the MiG-23 and Su-27 entered service, they did so within a strategic framework that had already proven vulnerable. In war colleges across Russia today, the lessons are no longer hidden. Cadets study the failures of the Vietnam-era MiG squadrons. They learn how initiative was stifled by command chains, how centralized radar control became a death sentence, and how the refusal to believe in the enemy's innovation led to unnecessary deaths. The Cold War was not won in a single battle, but in 1,000 invisible shifts, moments when doctrine cracked, when pilots died alone in the sky without warning, when generals refused to see what the Phantom had already made clear. One former Soviet radar officer, decades after his retirement, visited an aviation museum in the U.S. He stood silently before the imposing gray shape of an F-4. On its wing were kill markings, each one a MiG that never saw what hit it. When asked what he thought, he answered with quiet finality, "We never understood what we were fighting." And that, in the end, was the ghost the Cold War left behind, not just in wreckage and radar tapes, but in the realization that the battlefield had changed, and one side never saw it coming.